Planners say the future's urban, high-rises, public transportation, bicycles, density. Think again, says Joel Kotkin. People still want homes with yards and their automobiles. In California, it's headed for disaster. The provocative Joel Kotkin, next on Inside OC. Inside OC is brought to you by 5 Point. 5 Point is an independent real estate development company with assets under management across California. 5 Point is a proud sponsor of public television and community programming. Hi, I'm Rick Reiff, and welcome to Inside OC. Well, if you read the Sunday editorial section of the Orange County Register, you know him. If you read the Daily Beast, Forbes.com, or the op-ed page of the Wall Street Journal, you probably know him. You might also know him from numerous other articles, papers, his several books. He's a prolific writer and deep thinker whose provocative views on everything from urban planning to the politics of California has drawn many cheers and a few jeers. Joining me, fellow in urban studies at Chapman University, Joel Kotkin. Joel, great to have you.
Nice to be here.
Okay, so let's start with your own personal odyssey, because that has a lot to do with the subject matter that you deal with. You started out Brooklyn, Long Island, Berkeley, now you're in Orange County. Tell us about this journey you've made.
Well, the first journey obviously was to California, and because we had family in the Bay Area, so I went there. But the big bulk of time was 40 years in the city of Los Angeles. And about 3-4 months ago, we decided to move and we down to Orange County, partially because of Chapman, partially because of my work with the Register, and partially because we wanted to go live in a nice neighborhood where my daughter could go to public school. I mean, it's really almost as simple as that.
Now, there's people in Los Angeles who would call this heresy.
Well, I mean, 10,000 people more a year move to Orange County from LA than the other way around. So I'm not by myself.
And why is that?
Well, I think what happens is if you look at the demographics, LA is losing pretty heavily among what you might call Xers and among boomers. And it's had a very big reduction in the number of children, because part of the problem is it's extremely expensive, and then you add extremely expensive housing to the fact that if you have children that you have to go to private school in most of the city. That makes it impossible for other people. Plus, as a business center, LA is not what it was, 10 years ago, much less 40 years ago.
You talk about one of the differences you notice is just driving on the freeway when you go from one place to another.
Yeah, it's always funny because when I was doing the commute to Chapman from LA, I'd be on the 5, which was literally like being in a developing country. And a lot of developing countries are better. You get to Orange County, oh yeah, this is the first world. It's like all of a sudden I leapt about, maybe a century or two. I mean, it's like enormously different infrastructure here. The biggest difference is the ability to get from A to B quickly. Whereas in LA, you were always, you weren't sure whether going to the airport was going to take you an hour or hour and a half or 45 minutes. Orange County is more predictable, that's for sure.
Having said all that, Orange County's not cheap.
No.
Orange County's got some problems in certain areas of the county.
Well, the thing about Orange County that's interesting is, yes, it has many problems, but it also has the capacity for some interesting solutions. One thing on the study we're working on now at Chapman is that Orange County is the largest part of the U.S. in terms of population that has effectively no downtown. So it's grown a lot of little nodes that are actually quite interesting and very accessible. And that Orange County's strategy should not be to copy what Los Angeles or New York has done, but to try to figure out what it is that people like here, what is it going to be that's going to attract them, and then work on that.
So then what's something Orange County shouldn't be doing?
Well, one thing is I think to invest in a major rail system would be almost insane.
But there has been some talk about doing rail.
Well, I've just finished studying rail in every single case outside of what we call legacy cities, old cities that like New York that were built a long time ago, where subways make a lot of sense. Almost everyone has lost market share since 1990. Because what they do is they eviscerate the buses, which are actually quite practical, and they go to rail. And I think the whole idea is, and this is what I find very interesting about progressives, they want to spend money on a system which is really designed to promote real estate speculation and to get yuppies into trains out of cars. At the same time, they're doing a tremendous disservice to the people who actually really need transit. So they cut the bus routes, they raise the bus fares in order basically to keep the rail system going. And I don't think it's very effective.
Okay, so you just mentioned progressives and you mentioned what you think is a wrong-headed policy. So let's get into the latest book that you've written, and it's something you write about a lot, and you call it the new class conflict.
Right.
What is the new class conflict?
Well, I think what we're doing is we're going into a new era in America where, first of all, it's obviously clear that we have enormous problems with inequality. I mean, that's pretty clear. But what's really happening is that our economy is being increasingly dominated by a group of predominantly tech companies that don't employ a lot of people, don't need a mass middle class, have no unions, and in many cases are more displacing employment than adding. And those companies are now the predominant force in the Democratic Party. And they've really changed the Democratic Party from the old Social Democratic Party, which I was very involved with and supported, to something that's actually quite elitist.
So is Silicon Valley is elitist?
Silicon Valley, Hollywood. I mean, you'll hear people say, "Oh, LA is becoming like the new, transit mecca and all that." Well, it's not happening. Obviously, less people are taking transit than they were as a percentage from 20, 25 years ago. But the other thing is that we're creating an economy which really only has room for the very high end and the very low end. You have the very high-end jobs in Hollywood and Silicon Valley, some business services, and then a huge service class. And so we're beginning to look a little more like Victorian England than we are 1950s California.
Is this a national problem or something unique to California?
No, this is certainly a national, it's more than a national problem. You see it in Europe, you see it in Asia as well. But California is an exaggerated form because the policies that are there that, for instance, drive up the cost of housing. You're talking about sometimes houses costing $300,000 just for entitlement. So obviously they're not going to be cheap under any circumstances. So California has advanced policies, whether they're on energy or on planning, that are so expensive that they make the problem much worse. The problems exist most places in the country. They are more extreme here.
How do California's energy policies hurt poor folks or working folks?
Well, if you have a price of electricity that's twice that of the rest of the country, well, nobody who's going to open a factory that uses electricity is going to be there. Intel's not going to be building chip factories in California, okay? Those provided good jobs of all kinds. You also have the bills that people pay. Like, this is very interesting. One recent study showed that whereas someone in Marin County may spend $200 a month on electricity in the summer, somebody in Madera spends $500. But Marin is one of the richest counties in the country, and Madera is one of the poorest.
And why do they spend less in Marin?
Well, Marin has a coastal climate, like a kind of a Newport Beach kind of climate, and
so
Madera
you don't have to run your air conditioner all the time.
Right, not remotely as much. So essentially what you've done is you've put the biggest burden on those least likely to pay or be able to pay. And that is a consistent, I assume, unintended consequence of many of these so-called progressive policies.
Now, is this by accident or design? I mean, in Wikipedia, that great source, it talks about you saying that the rise of what you call the high-tech oligarchy, dominant academic and media elite, expansive government bureaucracy, declining middle class. It almost sounds conspiratorial. Is this by design?
I don't think it's consciously by design. I think it's the idea that all these people talk to each other and they all only speak to each other. So if I'll go to a conference and let's say you're with planners, and they'll all say, well, everybody's taking transit, everything's moving to transit, people aren't driving, we're at peak car. Well, cars just had the biggest sales month in history. I mean, obviously when people get jobs, they get cars. But you can't counter that idea when everybody has the same ideology. In other words, what we've seen is instead of a proliferation of different forms of progressivism, it's becoming much, much more kind of like Stalinism. It's like you have to sign on to every single one of these principles. And as much as I don't consider myself a conservative, I do find my conservative friends are saying, well, I agree with you on this, I disagree with you on that, and then we can be friends and we can talk about those things that we agree upon.
Well, in fact, you refer to yourself as a conservative Democrat. So I think you're the one. You're the one. I mean,
Jim Webb's not there anymore.
All right, Jim Webb and you. Conservative Democrats, there aren't too many of them. How do you define conservative Democrat?
Well, I've never called myself a conservative Democrat, but I would say I'm an old...
Wikipedia calls you a conservative
what do they know?
Democrat.
I've never even used that term.
They actually said you're a conservative Democrat, so whatever that means.
All right, well, okay. I don't think that's what I am. But what I would say is I'm an old social Democrat. In other words, I believe the role of government is to make it easier for people to rise up into the income ladder to become more self-sufficient. I think that's what Pat Brown was about. I think that's what Harry Truman was about.
Boy, you're going way back.
Pat Brown, even to some extent, Bill Clinton. I worked at the Democratic Leadership Council. There was still this kind of belief. The new Democrats, or the new kind of progressive Democrats today, very different focus, much more redistribution, much more very draconian environmental approach, much more enforced densification. In other words, what we've got to do is kill the suburbs so that everybody move to the city. Well, the suburbs were built in large part because middle-class people wanted a decent life. And it was one of the great progressions of upward mobility in the history of the world, whether in the US, Australia, the United Kingdom, Canada. Suburbs gave people a quality of life that only rich people had before. And now we're saying, oh, no, that's not good. You're going to have to go live in the city where an apartment is extremely expensive, where you'll probably be a renter, where if you take the bus, you'll have a much longer commute, and your kids will go to bad schools. I don't know if that's social uplift. I must be missing something.
What about the people, though, that say, look, we've got an energy crisis, we've got global warming, we have to protect the environment, we have to cut down on fossil fuels. Places are becoming more populated. Of course, we're going to have more density. We have to start living like this.
Well, I mean, it's interesting when many of the people who tell you that they should do it don't live that way at all. I mean, there was a wonderful piece by Dave Zandheiser, who's now at the LA Times, so this is when he was at the LA Weekly, where we went to the houses of all the smart growth advocates, and they all lived in these gigantic houses far from any transit. You have people going to Davos. Well, people really have to live a more modest lifestyle. It turns out the guy who says it owns like a $200 million house in Beverly Hills. First of all, I think when people start acting like it's a crisis, maybe I'll take it more seriously. But I also think there are ways that you can deal with the emissions issue. The big reason emissions in the US dropped was going from coal to natural gas. Obviously, nuclear power could play a role if we wanted it to. There's lots of things we could do without destroying the entire middle and working classes of America. So that a bunch of rich Greens in San Francisco can feel good about themselves. Somehow, that doesn't strike me as social justice.
Now, of course, when you talk like that, the academics you refer to basically consider that heresy. And you have your critics. By the way, congratulations, OC Weekly just named you one of the scariest people in Orange County because you subscribe to the theory that Californian cities are liberal hellholes and Texas and suburbs are God's gift to humanity.
Well, what about suburbs in California? Are those hellholes also, or are those? First of all, obviously, I never said any of those things, which is fine. But I think that fundamentally, what we have to say is people, particularly in a place like Orange County, they come here to live a certain quality of life. Yeah. And if you take that quality of life away from them, I think you're not doing them a service. And I think that one of the things about Orange County that I've been impressed with is how many areas have good public schools. So, all right, do you consider it to be bad for the environment that I live in a neighborhood where I walk my daughter to school every morning? Is it bad that I'm in an area where I use 1 tank of gas a month? Yeah. I don't know, is that somehow bad? Right. But if I lived in LA and the schools are bad and I have to drive my daughter a half hour to a decent school, is that more environmentally responsible? So I think that what we're doing is we're taking an agenda that has existed for a long time. There has been there's been virtually no support for the idea of suburbia in academia, among planners, and among some developers for as long as I can remember. And so now climate change has become sort of their killer app to get what they've always wanted anyway.
To go back for a moment to critics, because I Googled Joel Kotkin and critics, and a bunch of names popped up. Richard Florida, who's an academic author, and in fact, the clash of you two titans have been the subject of articles and things like that. I guess if I was going to distill maybe the key arguments, one is that sometimes you play fast and loose with the facts. And the one example, just to give one example, is you referred to a study that said millennials want to own homes. And the writer of this said you deduced from that millennials want to live in the suburbs, and that there's lots of nice homes. You can buy a home in the city, and that so that was one thing. The other one, well, why don't you address that first?
Well, first of all, we now have, and over the last few years, we've gotten every year more and more confirmation, whether it's MAGID, whether it's the Demand Institute, whether it's the realtors, whether it's the ULI, which is certainly not pro-suburb, is that A, they want single family houses. They only have limited money. The only places you can buy single family houses that are in the city or close to the city and have good schools are the most expensive places. Beverly Hills, that's a classic of Bethesda. These are places that are close to the urban core where you have a house, and they're also very, very expensive because people bought there many years ago. They're nice places to live. If you take a look at where are millennials, particularly people in their 30s, where are Xers, the next generation, the little bit older in their 40s, they're moving to the suburbs, they're buying in the suburbs, they're buying single family houses. You don't really have that many options to buy single family houses in most American cities, particularly if you factor in the issues of
regardless
cost
of the interpretation of that survey, you think the facts are on your side?
They're pretty overwhelming. I mean, the numbers of surveys, Trulia has certainly done work on this. I mean, it's clear. They used to say millennials don't want single family houses. That was the whole thing. Oh, they want to live in apartments and all that. Now they've sort of given that up. And now they say, well, they want to live in houses in the city. Well, I think a lot of them would, but the question is, where do you live in the city? Do you live in a city where the schools are bad? Do you live in a city where things are dangerous? Or conversely, do you go to those areas that have always been very comfortable areas where it's extraordinarily expensive? I mean, if you go to the really nice single-family neighborhoods in LA, they are incredibly expensive. If you want to live in Culver City, it's going to cost you $1 million, $1.5 million.
Are there any cities in California or elsewhere, an old city that had problems that has turned it around?
Well, the cities have turned a lot of problems around. I mean, their downtowns are better. I mean, that's almost every case. But is there a city that's fixed its schools, that's fixed its transportation infrastructure? Not so many. There are some that are in better shape, but they always miss something. Like if you take Denver, Denver's done well economically, but most of the middle class lives in the suburbs. I mean, there is virtually no case where the middle class does not live overwhelmingly in the suburbs. And if you add families, then you're talking about 2 to 3 times higher percentage.
The other criticism, which I think this one maybe has a little more heft to it, is just the argument, Joel, you talk about these places being high priced. That's because people want to live there. The high prices are a reflection of demand. And the reason San Francisco is more expensive than Houston is that San Francisco's nicer than Houston. How do you respond to that?
Well, first of all, there's no question that San Francisco, which is a very small city, it's basically about a quarter of the population of Orange County.
Well, let's use New York City then as an example.
Well, but a lot of New York City isn't expensive. It's just a lot of it's really crummy. It's just that the hipster types never visit those places, which are exactly where my parents grew up. So I know these places, and they're not very nice. I think that there's some misunderstanding about what's going on. And there's no question, California historically has always had higher prices, but the higher prices relative to income, you always was the same all over the country, about three times what your household income was for the median price house. Now in the Bay Area, you're at 8, 9. So the percentage of your income that goes to housing is extremely large. Now, the worst case scenario, unfortunately, tends to be LA, because LA has had very little income growth, but it's also had this high growth in housing prices. But why do we have these increases? Certainly, it started with the regulatory side. In other words, when you decided that it takes X amount of time to get a project done. I mean, when you talk to developers around the country, say, well, have you developed anything in California? I said, yeah, I did once, and I'll never do it again. Because they go through so much hassle. You even can talk to developers in the Inland Empire. They're being tortured by the planners, to build basic middle class housing. So I really think that yes, there are always going to be places that are desirable. It's how much more does it cost relative to income than it did before. The other thing is this: coastal places, San Francisco, coastal Orange County, prices in Newport Beach don't go down. Basically, they can't go down because it's a global market. There's people who are going to want to live in coastal Orange County, or they're going to want to live in San Francisco, they're going to live in Manhattan, and they may actually buy an apartment and live there 2 weeks a year. I mean, so you'll have lots of places where people with lots of money from around the world are going to go. Let's face it, Southern California, particularly the coast, is a unique environment. It's always going to be more expensive. It's always going to be a place where there are going to be people from around the country and around the world wanting to come here. The question is, are there ways that you can alleviate some of that by allowing for the construction of housing at a more affordable rate elsewhere? I don't think you'll ever get to the point where Newport Beach will be cheap.
Looking into your crystal ball out 10 years, 20 years, what do you see for Los Angeles, Southern California, and Orange County? And can you really separate Orange County from that picture?
Well, that's going to be an interesting question. A really interesting question for Orange County is Orange County LA in training, or is it something else? And I would argue that the strategy for Orange County that we're developing is it has to be something else, because we can know what's happened to LA. LA has become incredibly bifurcated. It has no economy to support its large blue-collar population. It's got complete gridlock, and people aren't riding transit anymore, or actually somewhat less than they did before. So Orange County has to look at how do we take what we have here and turn it into something that's viable. Now that means the development of all these great little centers, Orange, Fullerton, some of the things in Costa Mesa, the Irvine Spectrum. I mean, you can go through a whole bunch of these. You can develop them, but you want to preserve the things that people like about Orange County. Good transportation options, ease of getting around, good single-family housing, and decent schools.
Does that mean almost by definition that Orange County's never going to have a great downtown? It's never going to have that really rockin' center that people want to go to?
Where do we have a rockin' center? I mean, you think downtown LA is a rockin' center? I mean, downtown LA is better than it was.
I'm thinking of downtown Chicago, maybe.
Well, no, you're never going to have downtown Chicago or Manhattan anywhere in Southern California, and you're certainly not going to have it in Orange County. It's just, people have to understand that places have DNA, they have history, they evolved in a certain way. LA evolved in a certain way, multipolar with a relatively weak downtown. Orange County was developed with essentially no downtown. You just have to go with what it is you have and then figure out how to take advantage of it. But this ideology that says, well, we're going to have this big, dense Chicago-like downtown, that downtown was developed before there were even cars on the road.
Joel, you have written about cities and traveled to cities all over the world. You wrote a book all about the history of cities. So I want to ask you, the whole globe, what's your favorite city?
Well, that's hard. I can say in history, my favorite city was Hong Kong under the British. That was a great city. That was exciting, a lot of upward mobility. It's not probably quite so great now under the communist regime, but I would say that was probably it. For just the pleasure of a city, if you want to just walk, London, I would say would probably be first. But then the question is, where we visit and where we live are two different things. I mean, people say, oh, I love Paris. Well, since my wife's family is from Paris, I can tell you that the average Parisian, middle-class Parisian, lives in space so small and so congested that the average Californian would be horrified. I mean, other words, there's a difference between.
Sounds like there's some planners that might enjoy that. But.
Well, if they have children, I think they're going to have a hard time. But I think that what you have is you have a situation where people look at something that they visit and say, oh, if I could only have that. The same, you go to New York, it's great, it's exciting. Okay, now see what you can afford with an apartment. How are you going to live? You want to take the subways every day? All right, it's fun for, I take my kids on the subway. I carry a subway card with me. Would I want to live that way, day in, day out? I don't think so.
So I would have said Rome, because I love walking around, turning a corner, going into a big piazza, but there might be a reason I might not want to live there day to day.
Right. Well, there are lots of, the fact is that what Orange County offers is a great way of life for most of the people who live here. And we have to work, obviously, on the people who aren't doing well, but I think that Orange County is starting in a very good position.
Right.
The question is, how do we transform Orange County into a place where more people will go because it's an interesting place to be.
And we must end on that question. Thank you very much, Joe. That's it for now. Thanks to my guest, Joel Kotkin. You can watch this show and past shows by going to pbssocal.org, click on Productions, and then the Inside OC logo. You can also go to rickreiff.com. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again on Inside OC. Inside OC is brought to you by 5 Point. 5 Point is an independent real estate development company with assets under management across California. 5 Point is a proud sponsor of public television and community programming.